Hello and welcome to your weekly briefing for Global Conflict 1. This week I'll be covering days 53 to 59 and doing my best to document the various political changes that have occurred within this world within that time frame. Starting off as always with Canada, still controlled by House 2 with their allies House 7 and House 12. They're all still fighting House 19 and House 19's allies, and I'll move into their wartime progress a little bit later. The United States of America and Mexico are controlled by the House 15, House 18 alliance. They are now at war with House 19 as well. This is a new development that occurred shortly after I published the video covering last week's world update. So it's not exactly new news, but it is new in the sense that I didn't manage to get that information in time for last week's video. House 10, of course, in South America is now at peace with House 9. They're still allies with House 11 to the best of my knowledge, but they are trying to work a deal with House 9, and I believe House 11 is as well. So if they haven't made peace yet, it's most likely a ceasefire between those enemies, and a peace deal is probably imminent for both of them. And the main reason for this is House 9 has really lost a lot of its former glory. I think anybody who looks at the map can easily see that by now. So they are looking to either consolidate, probably move into another house, or simply try to go neutral and farm up a little bit. If they are joining a house, it's likely looking like it's going to be House 15. And if you recall from last week, I did mention that one of the former House 15 players, I'm not sure if it was an officer or a general, actually moved into House 9 and took over the position as House Marshal from the Codebreaker. And this was significant in the sense that it had a lot of players saying or guessing that House 9 was going the way of House 15, and of course that caused some concern for House 10 because of their previous history with House 15. But House 9 were quick to denounce it, saying that they were only bringing in this player because they had played with this player on the Europe Worlds. Well, as an alliance between House 9 and House 15 looks more and more likely, I am more and more inclined to say that it was probably a tactic to actually encourage House 9 over to House 15 more. I mean, if you control the House Marshal in House 9, if you have some influence over them, they're more likely to do your bidding. It's pretty much what politics comes down to. The important thing to note is that if House 9 does become a sister house or even an ally, they are currently an ally, so if they'd have to become a sister house of House 15, how would that affect House 9's current relationship with House 19? Because as far as I'm aware, currently House 9 still has peace with House 19, but that's unlikely to persist if they actually become a sister house of House 15 now that House 15 has joined the war against House 19. So all in all, it looks a lot like the world is pretty much teaming up against House 19 and their allies. That says a lot. I think that it takes the entire server. So these are about 4 big alliances. You have House 2, House 15, House 10, and House 17. All of them are now focusing on House 19. And House 2, I mentioned I was going to go a bit into detail here. They have made very significant gains into the Scandinavian peninsula and Europe. You see they're pushing quite hard, and especially the Scandinavian peninsula. These are all territory gains that have been made within the past week. So they are definitely pushing hard, but don't rule House 19 out of this just yet. Right now, the former House General of House 19 has stepped down to go into vacation mode, and this led to a lot of players speculating as to why this would come about. Some think that House 19 has already run out of faith points, but there is a more plausible explanation for this, and it really fits in quite well with the whole narrative of House 19 being a very tightly run ship. Namely, that we're getting to the part of the year now where players who haven't used their vacation mode yet should use it before the end of this year, because it's not going to roll over. So as many of you probably are aware, you can put your account into vacation mode twice per calendar year. Now the reset date is on January 1st, and if you haven't used either of your vacation modes this year, beginning with December 1st, it would be in your best interest to put your account into vacation mode to farm up for as long as you can. So this could partially explain why a lot of territory gains have been made by House 2, predominantly in Europe, because a lot of the heavy hitters from House 19 are now ducking into vacation mode to farm up the faith points while they have a chance. And the great thing about this for them is once the beginning of the new year rolls around, they have 2 vacation modes that they can take once again. So this would give them potentially 2 months of protection back to back, and that is pretty significant in any long-term war. So all of those of you who are in the camp saying that, wow, LOL, isn't House 19 really weak, I wouldn't count them out of it just yet. Wait until January 1st and we can see a lot of their good players come out of vacation mode and jump back into the fray. There is also speculation that House 19 and probably other houses that are using the same tactic, it's just not as pronounced as in House 19, and again I think this has a lot to do with their tight leadership, but that they are probably, those players are probably still in the world and growing up their alt accounts. And as anybody who has played this game for any duration knows, having multiple accounts that you control on the same world is against the rules. So I do not encourage that behavior, but pretty much every house has its alternate accounts. Unfortunately, it is generally accepted that House 19 is a bigger abuser of this method due to the fact that a lot of their IP addresses are not, or they are dynamically assigned, which means it's hard for Firefly to easily detect when players are actually sharing IPs or when they have multiple accounts on IPs. So it isn't that Russians maybe are generally bigger cheaters, it's simply that it's easier to cheat when you live in such a country, and it is also harder for Firefly to detect cheaters in such a country, thereby perpetuating it more so than in other houses. I'm not convinced that it is a nationality-based trend. It's more like due to the convenience and the opportunity that presents itself due to circumstances that pretty much transcend nationality, aside from the fact that it is an economic policy of that country. So if we start talking about House 17, one of the important things to note is that in previous episodes I've constantly bemoaned the fact that House 20 doesn't really seem to make up their mind as to which way they're going, because sometimes they've appeared to be allied with House 19 and other times they are buddies with House 17. Well, it turns out now they have actually lost their county in China, so I'm not exactly sure if some of the leadership left or if those players are now going to be joining House 19. But the point is, House 20 is largely off the map, and it doesn't really matter who they are allied with at the moment. There are a couple of other houses like this, but I don't really think it's worth the investment in time. House 17 themselves are pushing pretty hard into China. They managed to flip Mongolia, or part Western Mongolia, a couple of times now, much to House 19's dismay. House 19 themselves are focusing quite a bit in China, probably attempting to remove House 12, who are, allied with House 2 and House 7. So they're really focusing more on the Eastern Front right now than the Western Front, which, in addition to the vacation mode that I discussed a little bit early, or the vacation mode strategy used by House 19, could account for some of their losses on the Western Front. House 4 has been all but chased out of Vietnam. They still control a couple of countries here in the Middle East, and they're still at war, to the best of my knowledge, with House 19, and still on their own. Maybe it's because House 17 wouldn't accept them back after what they pulled, or maybe they are allies once again, and I simply didn't get word of it. And so, yeah, it takes a while for information to permeate the world and get to all players, and of course that is part of the reason that I do this video series, is to get at least some of that basic information out there that really is important, that is critical to the development of the world. And another interesting thing is what happens to House 6 if House 9 joins House 15. Currently, they are still allied with House 9, so if House 9 becomes a satellite of House 15, will they bring in House 6? And moving over to, well, Syria and House 1. This is an interesting case study because last video I mentioned that House 1 didn't seem to be very good at making up alliances. As it turns out, House 1's Marshal contacted me and sort of gave me a briefing on House 1's mission statement, or their world view, what their agenda is, and it has a lot to do with being warlike. They're a very warlike house, and they're constantly looking for fresh conflict. So it seems that, you know, the little spat they had with House 3 over land is still ongoing. What's left of House 3 is still fighting what's left of House 1, and of course House 15 got dragged into that entire fray. So now House 1 is also targeting House 15 in Central America. They're doing pretty poorly, truth be told, but they're not going to be making peace with House 1. And you might be wondering why I would even bother mentioning House 1, given that it's so small. And it is largely because the players in House 1 are about as committed as the players in House 11. A lot of people discount them due to their small size, but they are very good at what they do, and they can be a constant thorn in your side even if they remain this small. So it is unlikely that House 1 will officially ally with House 19, even though House 15 is now at war with House 19. And I would say it is absolutely out of the question that House 1, providing it maintains its current leadership, will ever ally with House 15. If the House Marshal's word is anything to go by, once House 1 has picked their enemies, they will generally fight them to the death. So there is that for your consideration. I think the general consensus now is that a lot of these House Marshals have gotten together and they realize they need to take on House 19. So they're going to do their best to put aside their personal squabbles with each other and not actually fight until House 19 is pretty much neutralized as a threat. So while House 10 might be concerned about the alliance between House 9 now, very potential, the very realistic alliance that could pop up right there, they are willing to overlook it and focus on a bigger picture, because they realize that House 19 is not anything to take lightly, as most of the other houses have realized now, and there are only a few that might not be fighting them. I think House 11 would be one of those. To my knowledge now, House 11 could still be fighting House 15, and that does make for an interesting situation. But if House 15 allies with House 9, they probably want to make peace with House 11 so they can focus on House 19. Either way, you know, House 11 has very veteran players in it, so once again, that is one of those houses that you have to cover, because the players shouldn't be dismissed. And I don't want anyone to take this as me being dismissive of other houses. It's simply that some players have been around in the game for a long time and are just in their own right very well known. It sort of conjures up the whole small fish in a big pond concept, where you might have had players that are exceptionally good on certain servers, but those servers were never very competitive. If you take a look at USA 3, that was a server that I covered in my build log videos. USA 3 was never very competitive compared to, say, Europe 1 or UK World 1 or now Global Conflict 1. It simply did not see the same level of activity and therefore wasn't nearly as competitive. So when you have big players from those worlds coming over to Global Conflict 1, you're not seeing the same... they're not on the same level as players that came from a couple of those other veteran worlds that were really competitive. You know, the cream tends to rise to the top, and when you're in a small pond, it's much easier to be the cream. So I don't want anybody to take this as dismissing, you know, the efforts of smaller fish, but you have to realize that the players that are in those more competitive worlds are probably better than you. Don't let your ego go to your head, okay? Just because you absolutely took names in an inactive world, and I'm not pointing at anybody, just because you did that does not actually mean that in a more global pool of players you are just as good, right? So I think that pretty much covers everything that happened in the past week in Global Conflict 1. As always, if you have any information, I do want to hear from you. Simply send me a mail in-game. My in-game name is David Spy, so I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.
Stronghold Kingdoms. What will you fight for? Play now for free.